What happens when a powerful man's cold business decision collides with his daughter's moral courage, and one moment of truth exposes the real character of everyone involved? This is an absolutely incredible story that will make you question everything you think you know about family values, corporate power, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. You're about to witness how one young woman's unexpected intervention not only saved someone's career, but revealed the hidden connections that bind us all together in ways we never imagined possible. If you want to see this life-changing confrontation unfold and discover how love and justice can triumph over greed and indifference, make sure to smash that like button right now, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories that remind us that doing the right thing is always worth the cost. I'm also incredibly curious to know where you're watching this amazing story of courage and redemption from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never look at family relationships and workplace power dynamics the same way again. The early morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 45th floor executive suite at Sterling Industries, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors and illuminating the impressive collection of modern art that adorned the walls of Chicago's most prestigious corporate headquarters. The building itself was a monument to American business success, rising 60 stories above the Loop and commanding breathtaking views of Lake Michigan, the Chicago River, and the sprawling urban landscape that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Sterling Industries was a diversified conglomerate that had been built over 4 generations into one of the most powerful and influential corporations in the Midwest. The company controlled interests in manufacturing, real estate development, technology services, international trade, and financial investments that generated over $8 billion in annual revenue and employed more than 50,000 people across 12 countries. From their Chicago headquarters, they managed operations that affected communities and economies around the globe. At the helm of this vast business empire sat Harrison Sterling IV, a man whose family name had been synonymous with corporate power and financial success for over a century. At 57 years old, Harrison possessed the kind of commanding presence and absolute confidence that came from inheriting not just enormous wealth, but also the social connections, political influence, and business acumen that had been passed down through generations of Sterling family leadership. Harrison's great-grandfather had founded Sterling Industries in 1887 as a small steel fabrication company serving the rapidly growing railroad industry. His grandfather had expanded the business during the economic boom following World War I, moving into construction and real estate development that helped build Chicago's modern skyline. His father had internationalized the company during the post-World War II expansion, establishing operations throughout Europe and Asia that transformed Sterling Industries from a regional manufacturer into a global corporation. Harrison had inherited control of the company 15 years earlier when his father had died suddenly of a heart attack, and he had proven himself to be even more ruthless and successful than his predecessors. Under his leadership, Sterling Industries had acquired dozens of smaller companies, had expanded into new industries and markets, and had increased their annual revenue by over 300%, while eliminating thousands of jobs through automation and operational efficiency improvements. But Harrison's success had come at a significant personal cost. His single-minded focus on business growth and profit maximization had consumed virtually every aspect of his life, leaving him with few genuine relationships and a family that had been fractured by years of emotional neglect and misplaced priorities. His marriage to socialite Catherine Whitmore had ended in a bitter divorce 8 years earlier, costing him nearly $200 million in settlements, while revealing the emptiness of a relationship that had been based more on social convenience than genuine affection. His relationship with his only child, 26-year-old Emily Sterling, had been strained and distant for most of her life. Emily had grown up largely raised by nannies and boarding school faculty, while Harrison devoted 18-hour days to building his business empire. Their interactions had been limited to formal family occasions, awkward holiday dinners, and brief business meetings when Emily had needed financial support for various educational and personal expenses. Emily had attended the finest private schools, had graduated from Harvard University with degrees in international relations and social psychology, and had spent the past 4 years working for humanitarian organizations in developing countries around the world. She had deliberately chosen a career path that was as far removed from her father's corporate world as possible, dedicating herself to human rights advocacy, refugee assistance, and economic development projects in some of the world's most challenging and dangerous regions. The philosophical differences between father and daughter could not have been more profound. Where Harrison saw the world through the lens of profit margins and competitive advantage, Emily saw human suffering and social injustice that demanded moral action regardless of financial cost. Where Harrison built walls between himself and the people affected by his business decisions, Emily worked directly with individuals and communities struggling to overcome poverty, conflict, and oppression. Their relationship had reached its lowest point 3 years earlier, when Emily had publicly criticized Sterling Industries' labor practices in their overseas manufacturing facilities, giving interviews to journalists and speaking at university conferences about the working conditions and environmental impacts of her father's international operations. Harrison had been furious about what he perceived as a betrayal of family loyalty, while Emily had been appalled by what she saw as her father's willingness to exploit vulnerable workers for financial gain. Since that confrontation, Emily and Harrison had barely spoken to each other. She had continued her humanitarian work while refusing any financial support from her father, determined to build her own career and identity independent of the Sterling family wealth and influence. Harrison had continued expanding his business empire while privately struggling with the knowledge that his only child viewed him as a symbol of everything wrong with corporate capitalism. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, Harrison was preparing for what he expected to be a routine but unpleasant task, firing his executive secretary, Margaret Thompson, who had worked for Sterling Industries for the past 12 years. Margaret's dismissal was part of a broader cost-cutting initiative that Harrison was implementing to improve quarterly profit margins and demonstrate to shareholders that Sterling Industries remained committed to operational efficiency, even as they expanded into new markets. Margaret Thompson was 58 years old and had been hired as Harrison's secretary when she was 46, following the dissolution of her marriage and her urgent need to find stable employment with health insurance benefits. She had been an exceptional employee from her first day at Sterling Industries, demonstrating the kind of organizational skills, professional discretion, and personal reliability that had made her indispensable to Harrison's daily operations and long-term business planning. Over 12 years, Margaret had managed Harrison's complex schedule of meetings, travel arrangements, and social obligations with flawless precision. She had coordinated international conference calls across multiple time zones, had maintained confidential files containing sensitive business information, and had served as the primary point of contact between Harrison and the hundreds of executives, politicians, investors, and other influential individuals who sought access to Sterling Industries' leadership. Margaret's responsibilities extended far beyond typical secretarial duties. She had become Harrison's primary interface with the outside world, screening calls and visitors, managing correspondence, and ensuring that his office operated with the kind of military efficiency that Harrison demanded in all aspects of his business operations. She had also served as an informal advisor and confidant, providing insights about people and situations that helped Harrison navigate the complex social and political dynamics of high-level business relationships. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret had become the institutional memory of Harrison's office, maintaining records and relationships that spanned more than a decade of Sterling Industries' most important business decisions. She knew the personal preferences and professional history of every major client, understood the political sensitivities surrounding various international operations, and possessed detailed knowledge of confidential agreements and strategic plans that would be difficult and expensive to replace. Despite her obvious value to the organization, Margaret had become a target for elimination as part of Harrison's current cost-cutting campaign. Her salary of $95,000 per year, while modest compared to executive compensation, represented the kind of unnecessary expense that Harrison believed could be eliminated through automation and organizational restructuring. He had decided that her duties could be distributed among lower-paid administrative staff and digital management systems that would reduce personnel costs while maintaining operational efficiency. Harrison's decision to fire Margaret was also influenced by his broader philosophy about employee relationships and business operations. He believed that long-term employees developed a sense of entitlement and job security that made them less motivated and more expensive than newer workers who were eager to prove themselves. In his view, regular personnel turnover kept the organization dynamic and cost-effective while preventing the development of personal relationships that might interfere with objective business decisions. The irony of Harrison's attitude toward employee loyalty was lost on him completely. While he demanded absolute dedication and discretion from his staff, he felt no corresponding obligation to provide job security or career development opportunities for the people who had contributed to his success. Margaret's 12 years of exceptional service were irrelevant to his calculation that her position could be eliminated to improve quarterly financial results. Harrison had scheduled Margaret's termination meeting for 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning, planning to conduct the dismissal efficiently and professionally before moving on to other business matters. He had prepared a standard severance package that included 2 weeks' pay and basic job placement assistance, which he considered generous given that Margaret was an at-will employee who could legally be terminated without any severance compensation. The Human Resources Director, Patricia Lewis, had been instructed to attend the meeting to handle the administrative details of Margaret's termination and to ensure that all legal requirements were met to minimize the risk of wrongful termination lawsuits. Patricia had worked for Sterling Industries for 8 years and had conducted dozens of employee terminations as part of various restructuring initiatives. But she had never been comfortable with the impersonal and often cruel way that long-term employees were discarded when they were no longer considered cost-effective. At exactly 10 a.m., Harrison called Margaret into his office for what she assumed would be a routine briefing about his schedule and ongoing business priorities. Margaret entered the office with her usual professional demeanor, carrying a leather portfolio containing notes about upcoming meetings, travel arrangements, and correspondence that required Harrison's attention. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Margaret said politely, taking the seat across from Harrison's massive mahogany desk that had been handcrafted from a single tree that had grown for over 200 years before being harvested for the Sterling family's use. "Good morning, Margaret. Please have a seat. Patricia will be joining us this morning for a brief discussion about some organizational changes." Margaret felt a flutter of concern as Patricia Lewis entered the office and took a seat beside her. In her 12 years at Sterling Industries, Margaret had learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when something unusual was happening, and the presence of the HR director in what should have been a routine morning briefing suggested that significant changes were about to be announced. Harrison had decided to conduct the termination meeting with characteristic directness and efficiency, viewing prolonged explanations or emotional expressions as unnecessary complications that would make the process more difficult for everyone involved. Margaret, as you know, Sterling Industries is constantly evaluating our operations to ensure maximum efficiency and competitive positioning. Harrison began, his tone formal and businesslike. After careful analysis, we've determined that your position can be eliminated as part of our ongoing organizational optimization initiatives. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, though she struggled to maintain her professional composure despite the shock and confusion she was experiencing. After 12 years of dedicated service and consistently excellent performance reviews, she had never imagined that her job security was in question. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, but I don't understand," Margaret said quietly, her voice reflecting both confusion and mounting distress. "Have I done something wrong? Has my performance been unsatisfactory in some way?" "This decision has nothing to do with your performance, which has been adequate," Harrison replied with clinical detachment. "This is purely a business decision based on operational efficiency and cost management. Your responsibilities can be distributed among other administrative staff and automated systems, which will reduce our overhead expenses." Patricia Lewis shifted uncomfortably in her chair as she watched Margaret process the devastating news. Despite having conducted many termination meetings, Patricia still found it difficult to witness the human impact of what were presented as purely analytical business decisions. "Margaret, you'll receive 2 weeks severance pay and basic job placement assistance through our outplacement services," Patricia explained, trying to soften the harsh reality of the situation. "We'll also provide positive references for your job search and continuation of your health insurance benefits for 30 days. Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the full implications of her termination began to sink in. At 58 years old, finding new employment with comparable salary and benefits would be extremely difficult, particularly in a job market that often discriminated against older workers regardless of their qualifications and experience. "Mr. Sterling, I don't know what to say," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly as she struggled to maintain her dignity in the face of such unexpected rejection. "I've given 12 years of my life to this company. I've worked overtime countless times without complaint. I've maintained confidentiality about sensitive business matters, and I've done everything possible to support your success and the company's growth." Harrison felt a momentary flicker of discomfort at Margaret's obvious distress, but he quickly suppressed any emotional response in favor of maintaining his business-focused perspective on the situation. "Margaret, I appreciate your service to the company, and this decision is not a reflection of your personal worth or professional capabilities," Harrison said, in what he intended to be a reassuring tone. "This is simply a matter of adapting our organizational structure to meet current business requirements." But Margaret's response revealed the depth of her shock and the personal devastation that Harrison's decision was causing. "Mr. Sterling, this job isn't just a position for me. It's been my life for the past 12 years. After my divorce, this company became my stability, my purpose, my source of identity and security. I don't have family wealth or other career options. This job is how I survive." The raw honesty and vulnerability in Margaret's voice created an uncomfortable moment of silence in the office. Patricia Lewis looked down at her hands, clearly affected by Margaret's emotional response, while Harrison maintained his professional demeanor despite feeling increasingly awkward about the human drama unfolding in front of him. "I understand that this is difficult news," Harrison said, his tone remaining controlled and businesslike, "but these are the realities of modern business operations. Employment situations change, market conditions evolve, and organizations must adapt to remain competitive. I'm sure someone with your experience and capabilities will find new opportunities." Margaret realized that Harrison was completely unmoved by her personal circumstances, and that pleading for reconsideration would only further diminish her dignity in an already humiliating situation. She had worked for him long enough to understand that once he made a business decision, emotional appeals were not only ineffective, but were viewed as unprofessional weakness that confirmed the wisdom of his choices. "When would you like me to clear out my desk?" Margaret asked quietly, accepting the inevitable while trying to preserve what remained of her professional composure. "Today would be preferable," Harrison replied matter-of-factly. "Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, and Patricia will handle the administrative details of your termination paperwork." The callousness of being escorted by security like a potential criminal after 12 years of dedicated service was the final indignity in what had already become the most humiliating experience of Margaret's professional life. She had expected that her years of loyal service would at least earn her the respect of being treated with basic dignity during her departure. "I see," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she absorbed the reality that her long relationship with Sterling Industries was ending not with recognition or gratitude, but with suspicion and dismissal. Harrison was about to conclude the meeting and move on to his next appointment when the office door opened and Emily Sterling walked in, unannounced. Emily had returned to Chicago the previous evening after completing a 2-year assignment with a refugee assistance organization in Jordan, and she had come to the Sterling Industries building to discuss family business matters with her father. Emily's unexpected appearance immediately changed the dynamic in the room. At 26 years old, she possessed the kind of natural authority and moral presence that commanded attention even in situations where she had no official power or position. Her years of humanitarian work had given her a deep understanding of human suffering and social injustice, and she had developed an ability to see through superficial explanations to the underlying moral issues that defined any situation. "Dad, I need to discuss something with you," Emily said as she entered the office, initially unaware that she was interrupting a termination meeting. "I tried calling, but your line was busy, so I decided to come up." Emily's presence immediately made Harrison uncomfortable, not because he was ashamed of his business decisions, but because he knew that Emily viewed corporate operations through a very different moral framework than his own. He also realized that witnessing an employee termination would provide Emily with exactly the kind of ammunition she had used in the past to criticize his business practices. "Emily, this isn't a good time," Harrison said, trying to end the meeting quickly. "I'm in the middle of a business discussion. Perhaps we could talk later." But Emily's social psychology training had taught her to read emotional cues and interpersonal dynamics, and she immediately recognized that something distressing was happening in the room. Margaret's obvious emotional distress, Patricia's uncomfortable body language, and her father's defensive tone all indicated that she had walked into a situation involving conflict or bad news. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting," Emily said, looking around the room and taking in the tense atmosphere. "Is everything okay?" Margaret looked up at Emily with eyes that were red from trying not to cry, and Emily immediately felt a shock of recognition. Margaret Thompson had been her father's secretary throughout Emily's teenage years and college period, and she had always been kind and helpful during Emily's infrequent visits to the Sterling Industries offices. "Mrs. Thompson," Emily said with concern, recognizing the woman who had always greeted her warmly and had helped her navigate the complex bureaucracy of her father's corporate world. "What's wrong?" Margaret struggled to respond, caught between her desire to maintain professional dignity and her emotional reaction to suddenly seeing Emily, who represented happier memories from her years at Sterling Industries. "Hello, Emily. It's good to see you again." Emily's social work experience had taught her to recognize the signs of someone in crisis, and Margaret's emotional state was immediately apparent. She looked at her father with growing suspicion about what kind of business discussion had produced such obvious distress. "Dad, what's going on here?" Emily asked directly, her tone carrying the kind of moral authority that had made her effective in confronting injustice in her humanitarian work. Harrison realized that he was trapped in an increasingly awkward situation. He could either explain the business decision he had just made and defend it to his daughter, or he could try to deflect her questions and risk appearing evasive and guilty. "Emily, this is a private business matter that doesn't concern you," Harrison said, hoping to end the conversation before it could develop into the kind of moral confrontation that had characterized their previous conflicts. But Emily's experience in refugee camps and conflict zones had taught her that moral courage required standing up to authority figures who tried to hide their actions behind claims of privacy or necessity. She had learned that private business matters were often euphemisms for decisions that powerful people didn't want to defend publicly. "Mrs. Thompson has been working for our family for 12 years, Emily said firmly. "If something is happening that's making her this upset, then it absolutely concerns me." Emily walked over to where Margaret was sitting and knelt down beside her chair, displaying the kind of personal compassion and human connection that had made her effective in her humanitarian work. "Mrs. Thompson, please tell me what's happening. Are you okay?" Margaret looked at Emily's concerned face and felt a wave of emotion that broke through her professional reserve. "I've just been fired, Emily. After 12 years, your father has decided that my position is no longer necessary." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Emily felt a familiar surge of anger and disappointment at her father's capacity for callousness toward the people who had served him faithfully. She stood up and turned to face Harrison with an expression that mixed fury with disgust. "You fired Mrs. Thompson?" Emily said, her voice rising with indignation. "After 12 years of dedicated service, you just fired her." Harrison felt defensive about having his business decisions questioned by his daughter, particularly in front of employees who might interpret such challenges as weakness or uncertainty. "Emily, this is a business decision based on operational efficiency. It's not personal, and it's not subject to family review." "Not personal?" Emily replied incredulously. "You just destroyed someone's livelihood and security, and you're claiming it's not personal?" "Mrs. Thompson isn't a line item on a balance sheet. She's a human being with bills to pay and a life to live." Patricia Lewis watched the confrontation with fascination and growing admiration for Emily's willingness to challenge her father's authority on behalf of an employee. In 8 years of working for Sterling Industries, Patricia had never seen anyone speak to Harrison Sterling with such direct moral criticism. "Emily, you don't understand the complexities of running a large corporation," Harrison said, falling back on the argument he had used throughout her childhood to justify decisions that prioritized business interests over human considerations. "Sometimes difficult decisions are necessary to maintain competitive advantage and ensure the company's long-term success." But Emily's years of humanitarian work had given her extensive experience in seeing through sophisticated rationalizations for moral failures, and she was not impressed by her father's appeals to business necessity. "I understand perfectly, Dad. You're firing a loyal, competent employee to save money, and you're hiding behind corporate jargon to avoid acknowledging that you're destroying someone's life for the sake of slightly better profit margins." Emily turned back to Margaret, who was watching the confrontation with amazement at seeing someone challenge Harrison Sterling's authority so directly and fearlessly. "Mrs. Thompson, how much notice were you given about this termination?" "None," Margaret replied quietly. "I was told this morning that today would be my last day and that security would escort me out of the building." Emily's anger intensified as she realized the complete lack of dignity and respect with which her father was treating someone who had served him faithfully for over a decade. "Security escort? Dad, Are you seriously treating Mrs. Thompson like a criminal after 12 years of loyal service? Harrison was becoming increasingly frustrated with Emily's interference in what he considered a routine business operation. Emily, you're being emotional and dramatic about a standard corporate procedure. This is how employee terminations are handled to protect confidential information and company assets. This is how you handle the termination of someone you don't trust or respect, Emily shot back. Mrs. Thompson has had access to your confidential information for 12 years. If you were worried about her trustworthiness, why did you keep her employed for so long? The logic of Emily's argument was unassailable, and Harrison found himself struggling to justify policies that were designed more to assert corporate power than to address legitimate security concerns. The truth was that the security escort was a deliberate humiliation designed to remind departing employees of their powerlessness and to discourage other workers from challenging management decisions. Emily, I don't have time for this discussion, Harrison said, attempting to end the confrontation by asserting his authority. This decision has been made, and it's final. Margaret understands that this is a business necessity, but Emily was far from finished with her moral intervention. Her humanitarian work had taught her that injustice flourished when good people remained silent in the face of abuse of power, and she was not willing to let her father's callousness go unchallenged. Mrs. Thompson, do you have other job prospects? Emily asked, continuing to focus on the human impact of her father's business decision. Margaret felt embarrassed to admit her vulnerability, but Emily's genuine concern and compassion made it impossible to maintain false pride. At my age, finding comparable employment will be very difficult. Most companies prefer younger workers, and my experience is very specific to executive support roles. Emily looked at her father with an expression of absolute moral condemnation. So, you're destroying the career of a 58-year-old woman who has devoted 12 years of her life to supporting your success, and you're doing it to save less money than you probably spend on wine in a month. Harrison felt stung by the accuracy of Emily's characterization, but he also felt angry about being morally lectured by his daughter in front of employees. Emily, you have no understanding of the financial pressures and competitive challenges that drive corporate decision-making. This is not about wine expenditures. It's about maintaining operational efficiency in a dynamic business environment. It's about greed and callousness, Emily replied bluntly. You're wealthy beyond any rational need, and you're firing loyal employees to make yourself slightly wealthier. There's no business necessity here. There's just selfishness and indifference to human suffering. The confrontation had reached a level of intensity that made Patricia Lewis extremely uncomfortable, but she found herself deeply impressed by Emily's moral courage and her willingness to risk her father's anger to defend an employee who had no power to defend herself. Emily turned back to Margaret with an expression of determination that suggested she was not finished fighting for justice in this situation. Mrs. Thompson, what would it take for you to feel secure about your future? What kind of severance package would give you time to find comparable employment? Margaret was shocked by the question, having never imagined that anyone would advocate for her interests in a termination meeting. I don't know. 6 months' salary would give me time to conduct a proper job search and maybe pursue additional training to improve my marketability. Emily immediately turned to her father, with the expectation that he would provide the severance package that basic human decency demanded. 6 months' salary, that's what you're going to provide as severance compensation. Harrison felt his anger rising at Emily's presumption that she could dictate terms for his business decisions. Emily, I'm not going to be told how to run my company by someone who has never managed a business operation or understood the financial implications of employment decisions. And I'm not going to stand by and watch my father destroy someone's life out of greed and indifference. Emily replied with equal intensity. Mrs. Thompson deserves better treatment than this, and you know it. The confrontation had reached an impasse, with father and daughter staring at each other across a moral divide that seemed impossible to bridge. Harrison saw Emily as an idealistic child who didn't understand business realities, while Emily saw her father as a callous plutocrat who had lost all connection to basic human values. But Emily was not finished with her intervention. Her humanitarian work had taught her that moral victories required not just passionate arguments, but also practical solutions that addressed the underlying power dynamics that enabled injustice. "Dad, I'm going to make you an offer," Emily said, her tone shifting from anger to calculated determination. "Give Mrs. Thompson the severance package she deserves, and I'll consider returning to Chicago and taking a position with Sterling Industries." The offer hit Harrison like a thunderbolt. For years, he had hoped that Emily would eventually join the family business and take her place as heir to the Sterling Industries empire. Her intelligence, education, and natural leadership abilities would make her a valuable addition to the company's executive team, and her eventual succession would ensure that the Sterling family maintained control of the business for another generation. Harrison had always assumed that Emily's humanitarian work was a temporary phase, that she would eventually outgrow in favor of the more practical and lucrative opportunities available in the corporate world. The possibility that she might actually be willing to join Sterling Industries was something he had dreamed about, but had never dared to hope would actually happen. "You're saying you would consider joining the company?" Harrison asked, his tone shifting from defensive anger to cautious hope. "I'm saying I would consider it if you demonstrate that Sterling Industries is the kind of organization that treats people with dignity and respect," Emily replied. "But if you fire Mrs. Thompson with inadequate severance after 12 years of faithful service, then you're confirming that this company represents everything I find morally objectionable about corporate capitalism." Emily's offer created a dilemma that Harrison had never anticipated. The prospect of bringing Emily into the business was enormously appealing, both for personal and professional reasons. But accepting her terms would essentially mean allowing her to dictate his employment decisions and would set a precedent that could undermine his authority with other employees. Margaret watched the negotiation with amazement, unable to believe that Emily was risking her relationship with her father to advocate for someone she barely knew. The courage and moral conviction that Emily was displaying reminded Margaret of why she had always admired the young woman during her infrequent visits to the Sterling Industries offices. Patricia Lewis was equally impressed by Emily's strategic approach to the moral confrontation. Rather than simply arguing about right and wrong, Emily had offered her father something he valued in exchange for treating Margaret with basic decency and respect. "Emily, you can't seriously expect me to base business decisions on emotional appeals and family negotiations," Harrison said, but his tone lacked the conviction of his earlier statements. The possibility of Emily joining Sterling Industries was too appealing to dismiss outright. "I'm not asking you to base business decisions on emotions," Emily replied. "I'm asking you to base them on basic human decency and long-term thinking about what kind of organization you want to build." Emily walked over to her father's desk and leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had spent years advocating for people who had no voice in decisions that affected their lives. "Dad, you can afford to provide Mrs. Thompson with 6 months severance without any meaningful impact on the company's financial performance. The question is whether you care more about saving a trivial amount of money or about building an organization that attracts and retains talented people who know they'll be treated fairly." Harrison found himself genuinely torn between his natural inclination to maintain absolute control over business decisions and his desire to bring Emily into the company. The financial cost of providing Margaret with additional severance was indeed trivial compared to Sterling Industries' overall revenue, but the precedent of allowing family members to influence employment decisions could create complications for future operations. If I agree to enhanced severance terms for Margaret, what guarantee do I have that you would actually join the company? Harrison asked, trying to structure the negotiation in terms that would protect his interests. You don't get guarantees, Emily replied firmly. You get an opportunity to demonstrate that Sterling Industries is the kind of organization I could respect and support. But if you can't treat a loyal employee with basic dignity, then I have no interest in being associated with this company in any capacity. The ultimatum was clear and non-negotiable. Harrison could choose to maintain his original termination plan and lose any chance of Emily joining the business, or he could provide Margaret with enhanced severance and create the possibility of Emily eventually taking over Sterling Industries. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the realization that her employment situation had become the center of a family negotiation that could determine the future of one of Chicago's largest corporations. She had never imagined that her termination would become a test of moral character that would define the relationship between Harrison and Emily Sterling. After several minutes of internal debate, Harrison made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. The prospect of Emily joining Sterling Industries and eventually taking over the business was too important to sacrifice for the sake of saving money on a severance package. Margaret, I'm going to revise the terms of your severance package, Harrison announced, his tone suggesting that he was making a significant concession rather than simply doing what was morally appropriate. You'll receive 6 months' salary, continuation of health insurance benefits for the same period, and positive references for your job search. Margaret felt tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face as she realized that Emily's intervention had transformed her termination from a financial catastrophe into a manageable transition that would give her time to find new employment. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I don't know how to express my gratitude. But Emily was not entirely satisfied with her father's concession. Her humanitarian work had taught her that truly addressing injustice required changing the underlying systems that enabled abuse of power, not just providing better outcomes for individual victims. Dad, I also want you to reconsider whether Margaret's position actually needs to be eliminated, Emily said, pushing for a more comprehensive solution. If she's been valuable enough to keep for 12 years, maybe the problem isn't that her position is unnecessary. Maybe the problem is that you're not recognizing the value she provides. Harrison felt resistant to completely reversing his business decision, which would suggest that his original analysis had been flawed and would undermine his authority with other executives who had supported the cost-cutting initiative. Emily, the position elimination is part of a broader organizational restructuring that has already been announced to other departments, Harrison explained. Reversing that decision would create confusion and could undermine other efficiency improvements we're implementing. But Emily's experience in refugee assistance had taught her to look for creative solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate interests, rather than accepting false choices between competing priorities. What if Margaret's role was redefined rather than eliminated? Emily suggested. She obviously has institutional knowledge and relationship management skills that are valuable to the organization. Maybe instead of firing her, you could transition her into a different position that better utilizes her expertise. The suggestion forced Harrison to think creatively about Margaret's capabilities and potential contributions to Sterling Industries beyond her current secretarial duties. Her 12 years of experience had indeed given her extensive knowledge about the company's operations, client relationships, and internal dynamics that could be valuable in other contexts. Patricia Lewis, who had been quietly observing the negotiation, offered a suggestion that could address both Emily's concerns about justice and Harrison's concerns about organizational efficiency. Mr. Sterling, we've been discussing the need for someone to manage executive onboarding and client relationship coordination, Patricia said. Margaret's experience and institutional knowledge would make her well qualified for that type of position. The suggestion provided a face-saving solution that would allow Harrison to retain Margaret's services while still demonstrating responsiveness to operational efficiency concerns. It would also show Emily that Sterling Industries was capable of treating employees as assets to be developed rather than expenses to be eliminated. Harrison considered the proposal for several minutes, weighing the potential benefits of retaining Margaret's expertise against his original plan to eliminate her position entirely. The presence of Emily in the room added pressure to find a solution that would demonstrate Sterling Industries' commitment to employee development and retention. "Margaret, would you be interested in transitioning to a position focused on executive onboarding and client relationship management?" Harrison asked, realizing that the new role would actually utilize Margaret's skills more effectively than her current secretarial duties. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events that had transformed her termination into a promotion opportunity. "Yes, Mr. Sterling, I would be very interested in that type of position. I believe my experience could be valuable in helping new executives understand the company culture and in maintaining relationships with long-term clients." Emily smiled with satisfaction at seeing her intervention produce not just better severance terms, but an actual improvement in Margaret's career prospects. The outcome demonstrated that moral courage and creative problem-solving could produce solutions that benefited everyone involved rather than requiring some people to suffer for others' success. "Dad, this is exactly the kind of decision-making that would make me proud to be associated with Sterling Industries," Emily said, her tone reflecting genuine admiration for her father's willingness to reconsider his original plan. "You're treating people as assets to be developed rather than expenses to be eliminated." Harrison felt a complex mixture of emotions as he realized that Emily's intervention had not only saved Margaret's career, but had also demonstrated a different approach to business leadership that might actually be more effective than his traditional focus on cost-cutting and operational efficiency. "Emily, I want you to know that your perspective has been valuable in this situation," Harrison said, struggling to acknowledge that his daughter's moral insights had led to a better business outcome than his original analysis. "Perhaps we should discuss your potential role with Sterling Industries more seriously." Delays over the following weeks, Emily did indeed begin serious discussions about joining Sterling Industries, but with conditions that would ensure her values and priorities were reflected in the company's operations. She proposed establishing a corporate social responsibility division that would oversee ethical business practices, employee development programs, and community engagement initiatives. Margaret's transition to her new role as Director of Executive Relations proved to be enormously successful. Her institutional knowledge and relationship management skills made her invaluable in helping new executives integrate into Sterling Industries' culture and in maintaining the personal connections that were crucial for long-term client relationships. But perhaps most importantly, the confrontation over Margaret's termination became a catalyst for broader changes in Sterling Industries' approach to employee relations and corporate culture. Emily's intervention had demonstrated that moral courage and creative problem-solving could produce better outcomes than traditional authoritarian decision-making. Harrison began to reconsider other aspects of Sterling Industries' operations, particularly their international labor practices and environmental policies that Emily had criticized in the past. He established employee advisory committees, implemented more transparent communication policies, and created career development programs that treated workers as long-term assets rather than short-term expenses. 6 months later, Emily officially joined Sterling Industries as Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility, with broad authority to review and modify company policies that affected employees, communities, and environmental sustainability. Her first major initiative was establishing an employee advocate program that ensured workers had representation in decisions that affected their employment security and career development. Margaret became one of Emily's closest advisors and collaborators, using her institutional knowledge to identify areas where Sterling Industries could improve their treatment of employees and their engagement with local communities. The partnership between the experienced corporate veteran and the idealistic young executive proved to be highly effective in implementing meaningful reforms. The story of Emily's intervention on Margaret's behalf became legendary within Sterling Industries, inspiring other employees to speak up when they witnessed unfair treatment and encouraging managers to consider the human impact of their business decisions. The company's culture began to shift from one based on fear and hierarchy to one based on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Harrison's relationship with Emily was transformed by their collaboration on corporate social responsibility initiatives. For the first time in years, they found common ground in their shared commitment to building an organization that could be successful financially while also contributing positively to society. The changes at Sterling Industries also had a significant impact on the company's business performance. Employee retention improved dramatically. Client relationships became stronger and more stable, and the company's reputation for ethical business practices attracted new customers and investment opportunities that more than offset the costs of improved employee benefits and environmental compliance. 2 years after the confrontation in Harrison's office, Sterling Industries was recognized as one of the best places to work in Chicago, and Emily was named to Fortune magazine's list of young business leaders to watch. Margaret had been promoted again to Senior Director of Stakeholder Relations, overseeing relationships with employees, clients, and community organizations. At the company's annual meeting, Harrison reflected on the transformation that had begun with Emily's moral courage in defending an employee who was about to be unfairly treated. 2 years ago, my daughter taught me that true business leadership requires not just financial acumen, but also moral courage and genuine concern for the people affected by our decisions, Harrison said to an audience of shareholders, employees, and community leaders. Emily's intervention on behalf of a loyal employee forced me to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how we treat people and how we define success. He gestured toward Emily and Margaret, who were seated together in the front row of the auditorium. The changes we've implemented haven't just made us a better employer and corporate citizen. They've also made us more successful financially by attracting and retaining the kind of talented, committed people who drive innovation and growth. Margaret had also become a mentor and advocate for other employees who faced workplace challenges, using her experience and Emily's support to ensure that Sterling Industries lived up to its commitment to treat all workers with dignity and respect. Her story became an inspiration for people throughout the company who had previously felt powerless to challenge unfair treatment. Emily's humanitarian background proved invaluable in helping Sterling Industries develop international operations that respected local cultures and contributed to economic development rather than simply extracting profits from vulnerable communities. Her experience in refugee assistance and conflict resolution helped the company navigate complex political and social challenges in developing markets. The partnership between father and daughter also had personal benefits that extended beyond their professional collaboration. Their shared work on corporate social responsibility initiatives gave them common ground for rebuilding their relationship and developing mutual respect for each other's strengths and perspectives. Harrison began to understand that Emily's idealism and moral convictions were not naive obstacles to business success, but rather sources of insight and innovation that could help Sterling Industries thrive in an increasingly complex and interconnected global economy. Emily came to appreciate her father's business acumen and strategic thinking while helping him develop a more sophisticated understanding of how ethical considerations could enhance rather than constrain corporate success. If this incredible story of family conflict transformed into collaboration, moral courage rewarded, and corporate culture changed through one moment of truth moved you and made you think differently about workplace power dynamics and family relationships, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more powerful stories that celebrate the courage to stand up for what's right. Share in the comments below about a time when you witnessed someone stand up for another person at personal risk, or when a family conflict led to positive changes in your life or workplace. Let's honor the Emily Sterlings and Margaret Thompsons of the world who remind us that doing the right thing is always worth the cost, and that moral courage can transform not just individual lives, but entire organizations and communities. Sometimes the most important business decisions are really moral decisions in disguise, and the greatest leaders are those who have the wisdom to recognize when protecting people is the same thing as protecting long-term success.